All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for keeping with us through the brief lunch break that we had. And I think we had a really good start to the executive summit with Minister Anand talking a bit about the government of Canada's defence, priorities. And so certainly we'll be able to now pick up that conversation with some discussions with industry, both in the panel that we're about to have now, as well as our second panel a bit later on in the day. One of the things I think that the Canadian Chamber's been really keen on, raising the profile is that there's no national security without a strong defense industrial base. Equipment doesn't appear out of thin air. It has to be, made by someone. There has to be ongoing in-service support and certainly a lot of R&D as well to, keep us at the cutting edge and be able to respond to emerging threats as they come. And so I'm pleased to have a distinguished panel with three colleagues that'll be joining us today. Nicholas Todd from CADSI, Kevin Ford from Calian, and Stephen Hampton from Telesat. And what we'll be doing for the panels, we'll have some brief opening remarks, and then we'll get into a Q&A portion. And certainly, I would encourage people to go to slido.com, hashtag executive summit, if you have questions that you want to put in, and we'll get to those as well throughout the conversation. So maybe just to start off with some opening remarks, Kevin, how about we go to you first?
That's great, and thanks, Mark, for that. And hello and good afternoon. As Mark mentioned, I'm Kevin Ford, the CEO of Calian, and I'd like to thank the Chamber for the invitation today and to thank the Minister for opening remarks as well today. Calian is a Canadian company that designs, develops, and delivers a wide range of defense solutions for military training, healthcare, cyber defense, satellite communications, and deep space exploration for domestic and global markets. The world has become a more challenging and uncertain place in 2022. The war in Ukraine has brought great power competition back into focus. The potential use of nuclear weapons is being discussed again. The major difference between today and the Cold War is the scope and scale of global connectivity, the evolution of weapons platforms, and the impacts of digital technology on communications. The challenge presented by great power competition in a connected and integrated world underlines the importance of expanding the defense industrial collaboration between Canada and the United States to build a truly continental defense industrial base. Canada and the United States face common threats and should be taking a more collaborative approach to continental defense and modernizing the North Warning System. The Minister of National Defense has emphasized the need to revisit our priorities, including the threats to North America, including from missiles and non-traditional threats. Air, land, and sea remain challenged, and we need to add space and cyberspace to those domains. Systems and sensors will be a major focus for the North Warning modernization. Integrating the best sensors, radars, satellites, and other systems is essential to maintaining a technology advantage over potential adversaries. Early detection is vital to NORAD, and Canadian companies are world leaders in this space. But modernization will be more than systems alone. Building an effective C4ISR network that integrates all the sensor data into a common operating picture to support decision-making, this will require innovative approaches. The pace of technology far exceeds the pace of procurement. Canada and the United States should be taking a modular approach to modernizing the North Warning System, where integrating the best and newest components and systems as they become available becomes the norm. This will require openness and collaboration with the industry in unprecedented ways, and I know defense industry is eager to meet that challenge. Effective continental defense also means expanding our day-to-day collaboration on cyber defense, training, exercises, and information operations. Continental defense relies on people in the loop, making sense of data flows, identifying threats, and taking rapid action to address them. This means training, exercises, and rehearsals to keep people ready for all types of threats, kinetic and non-kinetic. To sustain the quality and readiness of our people, we need to be more flexible in cross-border sharing of talent for continental defense, and this can mean people transitioning from government to the private sector and vice versa. These challenges are complex. No one's saying this is easy. However, the alternative is to continue with more of the same, and that is just not an acceptable outcome for Canada or the United States. The opportunity to improve continental defense relies on finding the right balance in collaboration and cross-border flows of talent, while also maintaining security and preserving our advantage over potential adversaries. And I want to thank you, Mark, for some opportunities to provide some initial comments. Back to you.
Great, thanks a lot for that. Sorry, Kevin, to help set the stage. Nicholas, over to you.
Great, thank you. Nicholas Todd with the Canadian Association of Defence and Security Industries, representing the companies of the Canadian Defence Industrial Base. And in terms of my remarks, for months, we've heard the minister repeatedly say, in terms of, quote, coming months, we'll be bringing forward a robust package of investments for NORAD. But today was the first time we heard her indicate her intention to consult industry as part of this. Not consulting industry is a serious and preventable deficiency when the outcome of NORAD modernization is to identify future threats and to develop technologies and capabilities to mitigate those threats. Consultations need to occur before tabling a robust plan. Much of the know-how and expertise of these emerging and disruptive technologies, hypersonics, drones, digitization, space, perhaps cyberspace, reside in industry or even academic science labs. They're not yet on military bases or in filing cabinets at NDHQ. Some cases, industry owns the infrastructure, like with cyber. Talking to industry cannot be an afterthought. It must be deliberate and a much larger scale than has been practiced to date. The cabinet's repeatedly discussed NORAD modernization over the last 5 years, including a recent MC reported in the media. And in that time, I don't think that D&D has yet to actively engage or promote Canadian industry at a level that reflects the magnitude of this initiative beyond individual procurements. Industry, I don't think, has really believed that it's been consulted on or informed of Canada's plans yet, beyond what we can read in the media. And we have to compare ourselves here to what the Americans are up to. They're several steps ahead of us at this point. They're already engaged in dialogue and information sharing, including at the classified level with US defense firms, where they're developing capabilities together. Canada lacks this plumbing or culture of collaborative capability development that's practiced in Canberra and London, Washington, and at NATO. So I hope we can get into how we can fix that a bit in the Q&A. In Washington and Colorado Springs, where the big decisions on NORAD are made, Canada's defense sector is marginalized as compared to American firms. The financial scale of NORAD modernization, many tens of billions of dollars, could rival that of the National Shipbuilding Strategy or the NSS. So Canadian industry is looking for champions in government, probably one or two key ministers who understand the scale of this initiative and who can provoke new thinking around a more robust industrial component to NORAD modernization. Because if nothing changes, this is a once in a generation opportunity that will be primarily left to the benefit of American companies and to the detriment of Canadian innovation, Canadian business investment and growth, high wage, high skilled employment here in Canada. So this panel has been framed a bit in terms of making the case for a stronger continental defense industrial base. And I contend we need to make sure that we make this case first to the leadership at D&D and around the cabinet table in Ottawa before we can present a convincing case to the Pentagon. Why? While the Canadian government and the CAF will need to make that case themselves to the US counterpart in meetings and tables where industry is not present. And for that to happen, we need to get the Canadian industrial policy framework and collaboration structures right, and that takes time. That was a realization, the conclusion, and the objective of the NSS. The industrial and technological benefits policy that's in existence must be the floor and not the ceiling to our industrial ambitions. Because in Washington, defense industrial policy is orthodoxy, and in Ottawa, it still remains heresy. Americans have a head start on us and a lot more experience on how to do this and own a lot of the market setting levers here. So it's important for us to get our act together quickly and to turn these good intentions into reality. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks a lot for that, Nicholas, and that overview. And I think we'll have a chance to unpack some of those themes a bit more in the Q&A. And Stephen, why don't we go over to you next?
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. I'd like to start off by thanking the Chamber for having me today to discuss this important topic, and I'll echo previous comments and thanking the Minister for her opening remarks. My name is Stephen Hampton, and I'm responsible for public policy and government engagement here at Telesat. Proudly Canadian and headquartered here in Ottawa, Telesat is one of the world's largest and most innovative satellite operators, providing secure satellite communications worldwide to broadcast, telecom, and government customers, including the Government of Canada, the Canadian Armed Forces, NORAD, and the U.S. Department of Defense. Telesat is currently undertaking the most ambitious program in our 50-year history, and the largest space program in Canada's history with Telesat Lightspeed, a global constellation of 188 satellites that will deliver affordable, secure, high-speed internet connectivity across the entire world, including all of Canada's north. Telesat Lightspeed will be truly transformational for our customers, including the Canadian Armed Forces. The world and global security landscape around us are changing rapidly. From the recent events in Ukraine to the ever-growing impacts of climate change, it has been underscored just how important our national security is and the need to ensure our women and men in uniform have the tools they need to keep our country secure. I mentioned previously that Telesat does work with Canadian Armed Forces, and today, more specifically, we provide the connectivity for the North Warning System through NORAD. As we look towards NORAD modernization, we at Telesat are focused on speed and ensuring that Canadian industry is working hand in glove with the Government of Canada to leverage the significant domestic capabilities that our Canadian companies have right here. Canada is a global leader with a global competitive advantage in so many key defense sectors, including space, and more specifically, satellite communications. I think one of the key areas of focus as we look to NORAD modernization and national security more broadly is the need for Canadian companies to work hand in glove with government from R&D through commercialization and to adoption. Not only will this ensure that Canadian Armed Forces has the tools they need, but it will also ensure that Canada's domestic companies continue to be world leaders, creating the jobs of the future, innovating, and contributing alongside Canada to our allies. Thank you for having me here today, and I look forward to having this discussion on how we shape a forward-looking national defense architecture.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Stephen. And just a flag for the audience that we do have a couple of questions that have started to trickle in on Slido. And for those of you who haven't used the platform before, you actually can vote up the questions that you like in addition to submitting your own. So again, I would encourage folks, slido.com, #executive summit. So maybe just to get the conversation started, I think it'd be good to really pick up on what's been in the headlines so much, and that's around Russia, Ukraine, and really specifically for the purposes of this panel, what it means for Canada-U.S. Security. Certainly, a huge human tragedy that we're all watching unfold day to day. Massive global impacts. But if we were to really sort of localize what this means for the continental defense, as well as the broader Canada-U.S. security relationship, what are some initial thoughts from an industry perspective as to what are the the lessons learned and what are we seeing that might be changing as a result of the relationship from the conflict? So maybe Kevin, we could start with you on that question.
Thanks, Mark, and it's a great question. I think some of the old lessons we need to relearn, and some new lessons we need to take from the invasion of Ukraine. It's clear. Conventional threats are taking greater priority, in the sense that it's a bit of back to the future with the Cold War, but it's not quite that simple. The threat landscape involves traditional conventional threats like aircraft, ships, and long-range missiles. And cyber and space need to be considered, along with supply chain disruptions that are impacting not only the military, but also prosperity at home. Modernizing North Warning System and versatile C4ISR networks is a big part in countering the conventional threats. The threat always materializes a bit differently than we plan, so having a strong technological overmatch and the ability to reconfigure based on threat is essential to success. We also need to emphasize high readiness training to respond to the global crisis and for continental defense. The Russian campaign has included land, war, air attack, and ship-based attacks. This really emphasizes the needs of sustaining high readiness formations through training. This means delivering training through NATO and with the United States for a wide range of domestic and international scenarios. There are implications for continental defense from what happens in Europe in terms of threat identification and resource allocation. We're deeply connected to our allies, so we should not view continental defense in isolation from our NATO commitments. Back to you, Mark.
Nicholas, why don't we go over to you next? And maybe, Nick, if I can make a shameless plug for the paper that you and I wrote at the end of last year, talking about how Canada can get off the kids' table and back to the adult solve. And I think certainly that was written well before the conflict started. But I think a lot of the themes I've seen certainly materialize in how we've started to have a bit more of a public discourse about Canada's future defense policy.
Yeah, so while NATO is finding a new life after accusations of being brain dead, many global multilateral institutions are not faring so well. The US is pursuing more unilateralism, coalitions of the willing, focused on specific issues or challenges. And AUKUS is a hard security example. The Quad's another example, more focused on technology and economic issues. But forming these cohesive small groups around a common a goal places greater onus on its members to constantly prove their value and relevance. And NORAD modernization is seen, I'd argue, in Washington as a test for Canada to show how we remain committed and relevant about the shared continent and its defense. And that this test takes place at a time when Canada, I'd argue, is less relevant, as we set out in that paper, in Washington on important security arrangements. Canada is also facing a deteriorating American political environment, rife with chronic protectionism across the US executive and legislative branches. That's putting Canada's preferred trade status and preferred defense trade status under increasing threat. There's more members of Congress now taking an active role in questioning defense trade, and the median view is more protectionist than before, especially among Democrats. Canada has fewer champions with influence, like Senator John McCain, who understood and advocated for a role for allies like Canada. And Canada is benefiting less from our binational preferences and arrangements, where we might fare better or benefit from waivers or whatever, compared to more broadly applied preferences. So we've survived here in Canada 2 very potentially disastrous National Defense Authorization Act provisions. The next time, we might not be so lucky. So I think in terms of getting back to the adults table, Canada needs to quantify, communicate, demonstrate how the Canadian DIB is relevant to America's future facing threats, how we advance US security and commercial interests, and not just rest on our past laurels and accomplishments and contributions. It's about what we can bring for the Americans tomorrow, very specifically. And so the Canadian government and industry need to be much more coordinated and coherent in our response, because the status quo and what we've done to date is not going to be able to get us to where we need to tomorrow and regain the lost ground that we've got.
Great. Stephen, your thoughts on this one?
I think the invasion highlighted a few really important things. I think first and foremost is the importance of collaboration. And we saw allied nations around the world all come together in response. The other big thing that it highlighted is the importance of the Arctic. And Russia's a neighbor of Canada's in the Arctic. And when we look at that in our own Arctic continental security, it's NORAD. So with NORAD modernization becoming an increasing focus, which is great to see, I think that's really where Canada's focus right now. And to Nicholas's point, the US is looking to Canada to contribute in a meaningful way. And I go back to my earlier comment about Canada's world leaders in so many different areas, and in space, which is increasingly becoming a focus in the military domain, especially in the US and with their allies in Europe. This is an area where Canada can really contribute and step up with NORAD and provide that contribution to the US as we look for the modernization. So that's kind of how I see is there's a lot of opportunity that's coming out of this to create this conversation, to have this dialogue and contribute in a meaningful way.
So maybe Stephen, there's if I could just jump to the audience Q&A, there's a question here on Slido. It's about sort of the value of open source intelligence, and what I suspect this person may be getting at is the way that the Americans have kind of gone about sharing intelligence. And I think if you look on social media, there's lots of folks out there kind of crowdsourcing ideas about what does this satellite imagery mean about the conflict. And given sort of Telesat's perspective, I'd be curious if you had any thoughts on the role of open source intelligence. And you talked about space and satellites, and how's that sort of changed over the last few weeks and months?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I think to the second part of the question there about the kind of emerging technologies and everything that's happening in that space, I think the US has always been a world leader in this and pushing the boundaries. So I look at DARPA, for example, and the work that they've done in that regard. Telesat's done a lot of work with DARPA over the last several years on our Lightspeed constellation. And it's really about capturing what new emerging technologies can do and the role they play. And I think as Kevin alluded to earlier, space, the domain of space is becoming more and more important. And we saw that in Ukraine, whether it was satellite communications or satellite imagery. These are hugely important technological capabilities that are only going to get more important. So I think absolutely it's an important area that we're looking at.
Okay, great. Um, so maybe let's shift to one of the topics that Minister Ananda talked about, which was the defense policy review, which was sort of foreshadowed in the budget. And so, won't surprise, I think, the audience to hear four people from industry talking about the importance of talking to industry. But, I guess the starting point for the conversation around the next defense policy is going to be the last one. So strong, secure, engaged. And, Kevin, this is something I'm curious to get your thoughts on to start is, what does it look like for government to engage with industry? I mean, your company engages with government every day, more on kind of programmed side. But what do you think needs to take place for there to be a successful dialogue with industry in the context of this upcoming defense policy review?
Well, again, it's a great question because I think it's one that's talked about often and one that, again, we struggle with, frankly, as companies to figure out how to best engage with government through the procurement rules, through all of the challenges that kind of come in just on how we procure things. From my viewpoint, what I heard from the minister is that strong, secure, engaged will still be the baseline framework. So that's a great start. So we're not starting over, not throwing something out and waiting 3 years for a new policy. We're going to start on the baseline of SSE, and then we will affect the changes to that policy based on the new threat, the new reality. So we're very supportive of that from an industry perspective, and that's wonderful news. I think what we're all missing, I think Nicholas referred to that earlier, is just what is the pathway for engagement with industry? We want to showcase capability. We have ideas. We have thoughts on this. A lot of the companies, Calian's one, but all of the defense industry and security industry in Canada, I think, is anxious to have a voice in this discussion as the policy is updated. So we really encourage the minister, her staff, the team to find ways to have meaningful engagement with industry as we update that policy. So that's number one. And I think, as I look at the opportunity, Canadian leaders and Canadian companies, we're world leaders in sensors and C4ISR and integration and cybersecurity. And we know these things are all going to be necessary for the Northern Warning System. So to get a clear sense of what already exists even and where the next generation technology is going to be essential. And I am confident that challenged, the Canadian industry, we're ready. I'm confident we're going to deliver on our program commitments. We want to be an active participant in this. We take pride in being a participant in this. So I think as industry, we're absolutely ready to take on that challenge, and we're looking forward for the dialogue as well as the updated policy. We know that the Continental Defense, from our viewpoint, will be better served as industry can be involved and share our expertise. I'm also cognizant of somebody who's worked in both government and industry, some of the challenges that creates. So my ask in closing really is, let's think out loud. Let's talk about how we can have meaningful engagement, whether through CADC or other organizations, to ensure that we have a voice in this policy update, because we're anxious, we're ready to go, and we want to be supportive and we want to help. So with that, Mark, I'll pass it back to you.
Okay. Nicholas, over to you for your thoughts on the defense policy review and the way that it should be done.
Yeah, well, just, to kind of step back here, we're about to embark on the fourth defense policy review Canada has undertaken since 2004. I'm hard pressed to think of other areas of federal government policy that has had anywhere near 4 comprehensive reviews in such a short amount of time. And no one Canadian government has reviewed defense policy twice in its time in office. So you have to think a bit why, what does this mean, right? So either the review is a delay tactic or the government has something significant and new it wants to say and deliver. The Minister of National Defense, she's spoken about this evolved threat landscape as a trigger for the review, right? So then if the magnitude of the threat is greater and the probability that the threats come to pass is greater, well then, what do we need in terms of more to prepare, or prevent these threats, be that diplomacy, development, or defense? And given that only defense seems to be subject to another review, then we need to assume here that the government believes that new investments for defense instead of diplomacy or development are the instruments of national power most suited to address this threat landscape. So that signals increasing expectations about defense spending, and investments. That build on the raised expectations in the weeks before budget 2022, where the minister was saying she was bringing to cabinet a plan for more than 2%, 2%, slightly less. But the answer to that in the budget was unspecified new spending, the $6 billion, so not 2%. Then the minister appeared to reopen DMD last week in some comments. Recently, the chief of defense staff said Canadian industry needs to increase its capacity and, quote, be on a wartime footing. So all these statements, again, they're raising expectations quite a bit. So if that's not the intention, they might want to recalibrate their communications a bit. Because I happen to think that, increased expectations on those levels are probably misplaced. In practice, and speaking to one of the questions on Slido there, the PBO recently found that while defense spending has increased under SSC, billions of planned and appropriated money, and Dave Perry's analysis also shows this going back further, end up being lapsed. So expecting that we can achieve 2% and the 20% of capital spending targets with the existing system and resources is unrealistic. If NORAD modernization is the unwritten chapter of SSC, streamlining defense procurement processes for that kind of environment would be another unwritten chapter. Developing a more advanced relationship with industry to enable that as well would be another chapter that need to be written if we're being aspirational. So it could be, in terms of these, especially around that industry part, focusing on dealing with emerging and disruptive technologies made by commercial companies that have little exposure to or patience for defense contracting. They have huge opportunity costs, and they can make more and deal with easier customers in the commercial sector. Long drawn out procurement processes work really well to de-risk established defense platforms, but it's the opposite of what you want to do in cyber or some other emerging disruptive technologies. The other issue here is that the pandemic and the war in Ukraine show us how Canada needs to decide what industrial capabilities we need to have here in Canada, whether that's vaccine manufacturing, some PPE, precision munitions, cyber, or other things that we're very good at, and how to vigorously incent their production. So kind of just to end in terms of the process for informing the defense policy, it'd be great if we could have at least the same level of industry engagement we saw through SSC, because that was much more than other times before that, where there was roundtables with industry and having a sense of what is the government thinking and a dialogue instead of either just questions without context, which is a new style of government consultation that's rather hard to respond to in meaningful ways.
Okay. No, thanks for that. And we did get a question about 2% on Slido, so I do actually want to come back to that specifically. But before we do, maybe Stephen, again, just to kind of get your thoughts on the defense policy review and what does industry engagement actually look like?
For sure. So I think first and foremost, it's great that this is happening. I think it's really important. And so super pleased to see that. Like Kevin noted, industry's ready to step up. We're all kind of chomping at the bit, ready to go. And I think for us, the biggest challenge is having that process or platform to engage with government, talk about what our technological roadmap looks like, compare notes about what the capabilities and requirements of the government are, and what we're doing to fulfill that. The second point I'd pick up on is what Nicholas just noted about working with and leveraging commercial companies who may not be focused exclusively on defense. And I think what we're seeing kind of around the world right now is this increase of, instead of doing these government-owned, drawn-out procurements, it's, well, if the private sector is doing this, let's leverage those significant investments that they've made, and let's come up with contractual vehicles that move quickly, that are dynamic, so that we can leverage these technologies. On that point, going a step further, technology changes so quickly these days, where if you come up with a program and define all the requirements and you don't procure it for 5 years and then build it for another 5 years, by the time it's up and operational, you're missing out on all the technological advances. So I think for me, when I look at the policy update, I'm really keen to see how we leverage commercial companies and how we can move very, very quickly and collaborate further, again, from that R&D through commercialization, and really leverage what the private sector is doing.
Great. So I do want to jump sort of back to the audience Q&A for this 2% question. And so maybe just to give a bit of context on sort of my thoughts, if I look back to the 2014 NATO summit in Wales, where, the 2% really was sort of given a bit of a momentum, injection. One of the common, criticisms that you would hear from, the government at the time, and I don't think unjustifiably so, is we might not be meeting 2%, but we're actually sending troops outside the wire in Afghanistan. And so the money that we are contributing is being used actually in a more effective way than, say, European countries that might be hitting the target or are close to hitting the target, but they're not willing to put people's lives on the lines to, get the job done. So there's this question about, is the quality of the spend or the quantity of the spend? And, we don't have to kind of dwell on that question necessarily, but it is a fairly complex, issue to talk about how you go about spending the money. And so, I mean, the question I'd maybe like to turn out, sort of building on the one from the audience, is what does a 2% defense spending world, look like? Do we have the capability to absorb that much in an effective, manner? Nicholas kind of talked about, some of this, but maybe, Kevin, go to you first to kind of just unpack from a Calian perspective, because again, your company is engaging on contracts with the government, and if we were to make such a quantum leap, what do you think that would look like for the system, and how would it be able to respond, if at all?
Well, I think, in my world as a publicly traded company, we talk to our shareholders a lot about numbers and targets and metrics with regard to growth rates and, margins and just metrics, just that you just can talk on for days. The reality is our shareholders keep us accountable for executing against the plan. And I think for us right now, I think the discussion around defense budgets, the discussion around commitments to NATO, the discussion around NORAD, the discussion to ensure we don't go to sleep on defense spending, because it's not a capability you can turn on overnight. We've seen that. We've seen that in Ukraine. It can change overnight. So from my viewpoint, number one, it's positive to see the dialogue around the commitment to 2%. It's positive to see the minister talk about $8 billion of investment on top of the already pre-announced SSE investment in defense. That's fantastic. I want to go back to Nicholas' comments on the ability to spend it and the ability to actually get that dollars to the streets and get the technology and the capability that our men and women of the military so desperately need to be effective in these scenarios. So my view on that is I think that the dialogue of having increased spending, I was just actually in Norway a few weeks ago at the Joint Warfare Center in Norway. Everyone is talking the same language. More dollars, more budget, more commitment, more programs, more collaboration, more readiness, more. You have a defense industry that's standing back to Nicholas's point again to say, we're ready. Like we are absolutely ready. We've invested millions and billions of dollars in research and development on all the things I think that are going to make all of this happen. Our skepticism, I think, still relies on the ability to actually get it to the street, both in the engagement up front and the actual procurement. And again, as somebody who's been in government, that's not easy. I don't want to say that as a knock on anybody. It's hard. It is really hard to transform procurement and transform how you collaborate with industry. I'm not saying this is easy, and I do respect the fact that everyone's trying every day to make it better. But I think we just got to think out of the box. We almost got to throw out the old system and think about how do we do this? The minister talked about in crisis, we've been able to respond. And I can say during COVID-19, we stood up mobile hospitals or COVID clinics, COVID-19 vaccine clinics at the speed I've never seen before in procurement. We talked about the crisis in Ukraine and the cameras that the minister talked about in the opening comments. I just hope it doesn't need a crisis to always have the procurement system be responsive. And I think for all of us, again, we're willing to work with government. It's not just the government's issue, it's defense as well, defense industries. We're more than willing to sit down and talk about not just the spending, but how do you actually get that capability to the street so we can actually help and support the men and women of our military.
Stephen, why don't we go to you next? I mean, because again, you're coming at this from the perspective of a company that engages with the government in procurement contracts. And again, what would a 2% world look like? Mm-hmm.
For sure. And I think I'll echo what Kevin noted, what Nicholas said earlier. Spending a certain amount of money and being able to actually spend it and deliver are two different things. And I think it takes time. And I think that the budget was a great first step. But I do want to see that continued progression of growing our defense spending. I think when I think about what a 2% world looks like, I think it's speed. We're moving a lot quicker. We're doing a lot more things. The minister highlighted how quickly we can move on procurement, which we can, and we saw that with Ukraine, we saw that with vaccines. And I think we need to take that kind of crisis mindset and apply it to all of the procurements that we're working on. I think there's a culture of, I don't want to make a mistake, I don't want to fail, which we see, frankly, across more sectors than just defense. And we need to get rid of that. We need to move much quicker. We need to do programs like Ideas and Minds, but make them bigger, put more money in it, be more ambitious, find out what the right technologies are, really invest in them and run with it. So I think that's when I think what a 2% world looks like. It's this openness to failure, moving quickly, trying new things. And to Kevin's point, this isn't easy. It takes time. It takes a lot of work, but we have seen it. We can do this, and I think that's how we have to start looking at this.
Great. Nicholas, you kind of talked a little bit about this in your answer to the last question, but again, sort of what does the 2% world, look like? I mean, you alluded to some of the work that, our colleague Dave Perry has done with the amount of unlapsed, spending, which shows that even with a less than 2% world, we can't, deliver on it. So again, sort of if you were to put on your sort of rose-colored spectacles and get the eight ball out and sort of see what it looks like, what does that mean to you?
So, our system as it is now is not designed or resourced for an environment of consistent abundance in terms of that world. And the procuring rule set, the culture, the soft norms, the relationship with industry, the industrial framework to promote the defense industrial base, these are all things that fundamentally need to change. The expectations on industry would need to be changed, and our attitude towards government as well. Maybe thinking less about specific narrow corporate interests and a broader attitude as well. These are all things that would likely change. And unless there's an exogenous situation that happens, it's likely going to be evolutionary, not revolutionary. And time is a strategic factor here. Is it us at war, or is it us supporting others at war, right? Because, I'm still scratching my head about what the Chief of Defense Staff meant in terms of putting industry on a war footing. We've been at war in Afghanistan and not been on a war footing for industry. We've been at war and and it's hard for industry to be on a war footing if government's not on a war footing. So I think we need to clarify some of this and how we go about doing it. And if we've got time, let's use it and use it well, and build iteratively on this, because that's essentially the Canadian way. And revolutionary change, leaps of faith, don't always end up well. So I'd warn against that if we've got time on our side.
And picking up on that point, we have another question in here on Slido around how do we fix the procurement, system. There's a lot of different parties involved. I mean, you have the Department of National Defense, you have PSPC, you have the Treasury Board. So maybe, Stephen, we could start with you as you look at this again from the perspective of a company who engages the procurement system. What do you think we can do to fix it? And kind of picking up on Nicholas's point, it's not going to be a revolution, but it'll be more of an evolution. And so what does that look like from a Telesat standpoint?
Thanks, Mark. I think it's about setting objectives. When we look at we need to procure this specific service or this specific piece of equipment, it's understanding this is why we need it, this is when we need it, and then building a strategy to get it in that time frame. And I think if we look at vaccines, perfect example, we knew we needed them and we need them as quickly as we can. So we set up a system to do that. When I think of satellite communications, for example, there's a procurement we've been consulting with the government on since 2008, and the in-service is 2036. It's just, but we still need that capability today. So I think setting clear objectives with a timeline and then building a strategy to achieve that. So that's one. Two, I think, is looking at domestic companies and the domestic capabilities we have. In areas where Canada has a global competitive advantage, we should really be fostering that and working in a much more dynamic way with those companies. We see it in cyber, we see it in space, quantum, etc. Canada is really a world leader in so many sectors, and I think it's about having that more collaborative environment and process where we want to move quickly, we need this, let's do it now. Those are kind of the things that come to my mind. It's really about executing on a strategy to meet the objective and timeline that we need and being more ambitious around it.
And so again, carrying it over to you with the same question about, from the Calian perspective, what is it that you think the system needs to do to procure better in the defense space?
Well, I think with the, Nicholas talked about capacity, the biggest opportunity and challenge we have with increased spending is trying to push, 2 inches of water through a 1-inch hose. And what I mean by that is that the capacity realities, again, at Calian, if I create strategy, invest capital, but I don't put the capacity in, and believe me, I do this every day. So number one, I think the focus and prioritization of that spending, there's a danger here we try and do it all, and we try and do it all in parallel. I think what we have to do through the policy review and the work between the SSE is identify the priorities and then commit to those priorities, and commit to them not only in the context of funding, but capacity to drive those priorities, get them done, make sure the funding's there, the people are there, and then put a timeline that is unmovable with regard to the ability to get it done. We can no longer afford delays. The pace of technology, the pace of transformation, we have to be cognizant that it's moving fast. So get focused, get the priority, make sure we understand what is got to get done, not just what's nice to have done, what's got to get done to ensure we're in the best possible situation to respond to the global threats. Make sure there's capacity, there's the people underneath it. If that means you have to slow down other projects or shut them down, do it. Make those hard decisions, but let's ensure we got those programs. It's clearly communicated in industry. We know what the priority is. We know there's capacity and there's a timeline. I think that's clear for me. Number one, we just got to do that. And the other point, I just want to echo what Stephen said. If I'm going to build a house, I don't tell the builder how to build the house. I tell them I want a 3-bedroom home with a basement and a window. Over to him or her to basically build that house. I think we got to continue to look at the objectives we're trying to create and the outcomes we're looking for, and let industry then reply and not have to deal with 5,000 pages of compliance matrix talking about has their switch turned red or green. It's got to get more objective based and let industry then do its innovation and respond with innovation so that we can actually demonstrate how we can build that house more efficiently, effectively, and something that'll probably meet and totally exceed expectations.
Great, thanks for that. That's a really, really helpful response, and I think really kind of a comprehensive view, and help to have, like, I think from a real business standpoint, because again, you're the one who's, seeing these things day in, day out, and I think your experience, you talked earlier about having metrics internally and reporting to your investors, and certainly, government being able to have a bit more of a business mindset to how they're doing these things would be, welcome and much needed. Nicholas, I know you and I have talked about sort of the procurement system from the standpoint of two advocacy, organizations, and as you look at the system and how it runs, again, what do you think needs to be fixed and how we go about procuring?
Yeah, well, it begins with, do people even agree on what the problems are? And currently, no. People, as you're saying, there's lots of different stakeholders in this system or the system of systems, and everyone's very ready to blame everyone else, including industry, blaming government. And so I think we need to figure out what exactly are we trying to fix and optimize for. And, through that, hopefully align some interests a little more. Is that a question of mapping the current system to see where the bottlenecks are and then what needs to be fixed and how? Because it's hard for outsiders like industry or us to know, what to change. We only see little parts. It's not very transparent. It's hard to say even inside that it's transparent to everyone else. And, so that makes it difficult to come up with solutions if we don't know or agree on what the problems are. And if we don't have any specifics, then, the only other approach that I can think of here is design or create a process to generate those ideas. If you can't have the actual people who are in charge of the processes, you find proxies for them and try something. But, it's a hard one to resolve.
We have another audience question that arrived with respect to NORAD modernization, and the person who asked this question, noted that Minister Anand made the comments about a high commitment to a high degree of collaboration, with the United States. I think certainly, though, we should be under no illusions that Washington has fairly high expectations of what we're going to bring to the table. And so, again, maybe Kevin, we can start with you. I mean, what is your sense of what the Americans expect of us when it comes to NORAD modernization? What do you think they are, thinking that we need to bring to the table to be a credible partner?
Yeah, it's a good question. And to be honest, I think from my perspective, I'm still looking for some clarity on roles, both in the context of Canada and US collaboration. We've talked about this, but it's not been apparent to me yet what agreements have been made with regard to capability, what country is going to be responsible for what, how is this going to work, how are we going to procure it, how are we going to implement it. So if I think about it, if I'm the United States looking at Canada, And I'm looking at, the strength that we've got in areas of sensors and C4ISR and cybersecurity, our satellite, our space capabilities. The menu is long, and it's very capable. And this isn't stuff that we're hoping to do. It's stuff we do today, not just for Canada, but for the globe today. The world depends on Canada for numerous elements of that today. So I think what we have to do is look at where's the right scope for the right capacity, again, back to priority and timelines. When do we want to have this modernization done? Who's in the best situation to handle the scope, and tear it down and then say, okay, Canada, that's you, United States, that's us, let's get at this. I think there's a danger to overthink this. I think the reality is there's capability in both countries. We both have majors and minors. People that know me, I use that a lot. We have a major in this, a minor in that. Okay, let's look at how we complement and augment capacity, and then deal with the reality of the industrial bases in both countries. I think what you'll see is, I think as industry, I've always said, we're good understanding, once we understand the strategy, both from a context of objectives and the procurement strategy, I think we can then work with government to make it happen. I think where we get lost sometimes, and we're frankly, we're lobbying government, whoever's lobbying government, maybe create confusion there, is when we're not clear on that. So we're in there asking a bunch of questions that's just creating a lot of churn in the system. So the more clarity we have on the scope between Canada, US, the program, what is the agreement, who's doing what to do, how is this going to be procured? I think we start there. And I'm pretty confident, though, regardless, whatever we're asked to do from a Canadian content perspective, again, ready to go. And we have a lot of value add in this program.
Great. Kevin, just maybe to build on your comments, do you think there's a good example that we can look to where there has been cross-border collaboration done, effectively, where Canada's brought the goods to the table, we've had that clarity of objectives, and there's a very well-articulated path ahead, or is this something that we haven't succeeded at really in any meaningful way as of late?
Well, I think, from our viewpoint, we participate as a Canadian company in many global supply chains. And whether it's, some of the OEMs we support, it is something that there's an ecosystem that exists today that Canada and US at the defense industry base collaborate today, despite without the government, telling us what or how to operate. So I think that's a great baseline to build from with regard to, we work with many OEMs today. They work with us. So we have collaboration now at the company level. It's just now working through the defense sharing agreements, the different areas to make sure that we can actually get through the bureaucracy and policy element of this to make effective change between how Canada and US operate. The Buy American, I've heard that a few times in today's session. I think the world is looking to a buy local. The whole COVID reality really highlighted the requirement for supply chains to be a bit more resilient and local. So we're going to have to balance that reaction to what we've just been through the last 2 years to the reality is that we're partners. We're with NATO. We're companies that are going to work together, and countries are going to work together in sharing our defense objectives. So I think build from that defense industry base that has those collaboration capabilities now, really clarify that policy objective between the countries. And then let's, again, put some timelines and actions with tangible outcomes on this. And let's not spin on this thing too long, because there's a war happening. We got to get on with this. We can't sit here and define new policies. We got to be responsive. And again, we're ready as industry to have a discussion with government, how best to do that.
That's great. Thanks for that. Stephen, maybe I guess we'll go back to the original question. What is it that the Americans are looking for us to bring to the table for NORAD modernization?
I couldn't agree with more than what Kevin said. I think in this world of buy domestic, buy local, which is increasingly the trend, we do need to focus on areas where we're collaborating with our allies, and we have a domestic competitive advantage and they have it in this area, and how do we bring those two together? One perfect example of this is the North Warning System. We're leveraging the sensors, SATCOM technologies from Canada, along with the US and their industrial base. I think NORAD modernization is a perfect example where we can really leverage the domestic capabilities from Canada and from the US in a collaborative way, where both sides are strengthening their industrial base. As far as supply chain, there's tons of cross over the border back and forth on both sides. So I think that really has to be kind of a focus. And then I think the other thing that the Americans are looking for is to move fast, set out clear objectives and priorities, communicate them, and move. So.
Great. No, thanks for that. And yeah, Nicholas, over to you on
Yeah,
the question.
well, some proposals on exactly some specifics on how we can work on NORAD modernization amongst ourselves in Canada and with the Americans, right? So one, developing a comprehensive strategy to maximize benefits for the Canadian economy, right? So here we can talk about NORAD modernization policy and investment plans must include clear Canadian industrial development objectives and targets. I talked about the NSS, where the government should seek to derive significant industrial benefit and economic benefits. We talked about the North for Canada out of these generational investments. Um, I've already talked about the ITB being the floor, not the ceiling of this. There's consulting industry as a second pillar of this, where the defense in industrial integration, if that's on the agenda, industry needs a seat at the table. This can and must include meaningful consultations in the phase of R&D and capability development. So seeing what actually happens with that money from the 2019 budget and being there to discuss that, so that we can follow on and have follow-up procurements from the R&D phase. Canadian industry would also benefit from greater clarity on, as we talked about here, what does DoD want from Canadian firms? Third pillar, I'd say it's around creating a Canadian community of interest. So this could be determining which Canadian companies have an interest and have experience against these capabilities, by having an ITQ or request for information. The resulting pool of qualified companies could then receive the required security clearances and begin to share information, be involved in R&D, capability development, and talk about policy issues that are related to this as well. This will help these firms better organize themselves and better position themselves for future procurements, whether in Canada or the States. And that's a move from the R&D to the actual acquisition. Fourth, it's around connecting Canadian capability with government and military and supply chains. So whether that's fostering R&D through the existing programs we have in Canada, the minister mentioned ideas or Innovative Solutions Canada. It's going to say CARPA, but that's been canceled. So whatever is set to replace that. How do we inform this Canadian capability development? So in our paper, we talked about a road mapping exercise to help set that out. Working with NORAD and Northcom, here it could be in terms of creating an other transactional authority. It's an American instrument, so it'd have to be something that they would create that hopefully would allow Canadian companies, without having necessarily US presence, but it'd be limited to American and Canadian companies where rapid procurement could occur, and where Canadian companies could start to build relationships with American companies as well to see what they could do together. And I think we also need to strengthen the basics. Much of Canada's binational defense trade experience and knowledge about Canada's unique status, entitlements, rights, advantages, I think is atrophied. And so here, there's another set of ideas, building on, say, the Canadian Commercial Corporation's new statement of priorities and accountabilities, bringing that, operationalizing that, making sure that EDC is supporting and BDC are supporting activities where CCC is at the table. That'd be helpful. We'd mentioned the degree to which we need to update DPSA and others. That'll take some time to figure out, but certainly lots there that we can work on to make this happen.
No, and I think, Nicholas, your point about having a community of interest, that might sound to an outside observer like a trite kind of processy, point, but really, having worked in an industry association that's as large as the Canadian Chamber, I know sometimes it's hard just to know who to talk to about issues, and I get the sense right now, in government, they don't even know necessarily who to talk to because they don't know necessarily, the industry capabilities, who's working on potential future capabilities as well. So, really, process heavy point, but nonetheless, I think a key one in the mix. We have about 5 minutes left, and so I'm going to try to get through one more question for the panel. And it was one that came in through the chat here, and that was around U.S. concerns about Canada's information security. And so, we've seen a couple of high-profile cases. There is the civilian official at the RCMP. If you go back several years further, we had the naval officer on the East Coast that had been removed and subsequently, tried for information that he was passing to, I believe it was the Russians, if I'm not mistaken. And so certainly, those plus, I think a perception that, Canada is potentially the soft underbelly of the North American, continent. This may be heard, in the context of the immediate aftermath of 9/11, as well. And so, to what extent do we think that these perceptions about Canada are, A, lingering, and then B, sort of speaking to the direct question that was asked about, how does it impact the willingness of the United States to collaborate with us? And so maybe, Kevin, we can go to you first for this question.
I think for the US, and I frankly say for the world right now, we are getting more questions as a company on our security posture, our supply chain, our resilience with regard to working with whether it's the US, other defense forces globally, even commercial customers now. What people are recognizing is that you're only as strong as your weakest link. And frankly, if your supply chain has got vulnerabilities which insert into your company, then the reality is you're only as strong as that link. So I would say, number one, it is not just, and while I appreciate in the context of today's discussion, it's a US discussion, but I would say from accounting perspective, we've never spent more than we have on cyber internally. And not we offer cyber service externally, but internally. Their CIO organization, and it never feels like it's enough. So I think working with government right now with our CSCs, our defense, being able to talk to the US about what tangible actions have we taken as a country to ensure that we are as ready, as defended, as technology advanced, leveraging hopefully the technology that exists in Canada, so we can move past this, because we need to move past this. If we try to move forward as collaboration nations based on a foundation of non-trust, this isn't going to work. This is just not going to work. There's not one country, one company that can say they're 100% cyber-proof. We see that every day. It's absolutely, it's unattainable in some ways, just with the pace of technology advancement. But what we have to do, I think, is looking at our policies, how we integrate technology, both internally and externally, whether it's in a company or in the federal government or in defense. We need to convince our allies that we are not the weak piece in the supply chain, that they can trust us, and we're putting as much effort and focus as any country is on ensuring we are exactly that, an excellent partner to do business with.
No, thank you for that. Stephen, over to you.
I'll just build on what Kevin said. Cyber is the hottest topic right now. It is the massive focus of pretty much every country and government. And I think the way to deal with it is collaboration. I know in our sector, we work very, very closely with industry, with governments here in Canada, in the US, around the world. And it all comes down to collaboration. You can't do this in a silo or a vacuum. So I think when I look at Canada and the US, we collaborate on so much, including cyber, and I think it's a continuation of that, and really working to align processes, align standards, share information, and to Kevin's point, you're only as strong as your weak link, and I think Canada and the US need to be completely interlocked on this important topic.
So, Nicholas, I'll give the final 60 seconds to you, and maybe the specific sort of twist on the question I put your direction is again something that I know you and I have engaged the government on together, and that's around the CMMC standard, and how that's one case study of how we can take action here to better align ourselves with the United States.
Yeah, well, certainly, the Americans are rolling out their version 2, and we'll have the regulatory phase complete by the end of March 2023. And the DoD and DIBS, US DIBS ability to send market signals is enormous, much more than the Canadian government. And so we need to make sure that Canadian companies can get CMMC certified and undergo those assessments from US auditors. And so CADSI, we've been working hard on this, thinking that, instead of creating a separate Canadian standard for, I don't know, a different Canadian threat that hasn't been articulated by government, let's just use this and get everyone working together across, Canada, US, and maybe others eventually, instead of spending time creating our own standard. we've secured a commitment from DoD that yes, Canadian firms should be able to complete this process and undergo audits, and that the Canadian government should not stand in the way of Canadian companies completing that process, waiting for some Canadian standard to be created, and then how is it actually implemented? Who's doing that auditing? The Canadian government does not have the resources right now to do that, so they'd have to find something third party to do that. And so, these are all delays, and you just heard from the other speakers about the urgency. And so, the quicker Canadian companies can move and go through the CMMC process, the better. And I'll end it there, because there's certainly a lot more to talk about this and the more traditional industrial security issues around people and places.
Well, let me just say thank you, Stephen, Kevin, and Nicholas for your participation in this panel today. An hour flew by, quickly, and certainly there was a lot more that would have been great to have unpacked and talked about. But there's always a finite amount of minutes that we can have the panel discussion for. So I just want to say thank you again on behalf of the Chamber for your time today. Thank the audience as well for listening to the panel. We are going to take a short 14-minute break, and then we'll have folks back at 1:45 for the final panel of the day. And I'd also just like to, of course, make a note to thank our sponsors for the ongoing support that's enabled us to have events like this on critical dialogues that are impacting the future of our country in so many important ways. And so with that, again, thank you to our three panelists, and we'll see you all back again in 14 minutes.